Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour. This is your host, Bill Frezza. Today we're going to take a look at a non-governmental agency, or NGO, called Self-Help Africa. They're pioneering a new approach to putting donor dollars to work based on a set of principles long neglected in the foreign aid business. According to the Wall Street Journal, over the past 60 years, rich countries have sent over $1 trillion of development aid to Africa. Yet real per capita income is lower today in sub-Saharan Africa than it was in the 70s. More than half the population, that's over 350 million people, live on less than $1 a day. Why has this number doubled in the past 2 decades, even as 1 billion people have climbed out of extreme poverty in Asia? Joining us today to help us figure out what went wrong and perhaps how to make it right is Will Galvin, Head of U.S. Operations for Self-Help Africa. Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Good to be here.
Give us a little perspective on the big picture before we start. What does conventional foreign aid to Africa look like, and where does all that money end up usually going?
Well, that's a tough one to answer fully, Bill, because conventional foreign aid takes many forms. So what one country says is foreign aid is certainly not what another country will claim to be foreign aid.
Why is that?
Well, there is no accepted standard. So you can have a country such as, for example, Italy. And if you look at what Italy is doing, an awful lot of its foreign aid doesn't leave Italy. So it provides foreign aid in the form, for example, of grants to Italian universities for students from foreign countries.
So it's
that qualifies.
So it's a cover story more than anything else.
Well, you might call it that. Whether or not there's any significant benefit to foreign countries from having their citizens educated in Italy, I don't know. I haven't seen that evidence.
Well, what about money that goes from one foreign government outside Africa to a government inside Africa?
Well, and that's termed bilateral aid, and that's a form of aid which is increasingly used in recent decades. It's seen by northern developed country governments as being a way of building the capacity of countries and governments in the south and primarily in Africa. So, if there is a health department in a country in sub-Saharan Africa which has, frankly, very little revenue, well, what do? Do you support non-governmental organizations and other international organizations to go in there and run their health system? Or do you try to increase the capacity of that health department by funding it directly?
Well, and sometimes, I guess, putting a lot of relatives on the payroll in the process.
Well, I think, it would depend on the country involved.
Well, let me ask, how does Self-Help Africa look at things differently, but not only from bilateral aid, but from other NGOs? Tell me a little bit about the journey you took to get there.
Well, we began 30 years ago working in Africa in response to the great Ethiopian famine of 1984. We started out by looking at the problem of famine and looking at it from the perspective of farming, because we said, famine isn't really a food problem. It's a farming problem. There isn't enough food available locally. And if you can grow more, well, then that answers the famine problem. Mm-hmm. So spent some considerable period of time working in that area. Did associated what we call interventions in health and in education. But gradually, I think you could see a dawning reality through our programs that really the problem isn't food. The problem is money. There's that famous, I think, misquote of the conversation between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway, which is to the effect of, there is a difference between us and the rich. They have more money than us. There is a difference between us and the poor. And frankly, they have less money than us.
So isn't showering them with money one answer? Just give them the money. Let them go find the food.
Well, you'll find some people who say that is, in fact, the answer. Give them some money and they will look after everything else. Myself personally, and I think even from our own belief system here in the United States, I think you'll find most people will agree that giving somebody money as a charity handout, as welfare in effect, tends to increase tends to increase their reliance on you. If you give somebody a meal ticket today, frankly, you better come back and give them a meal ticket tomorrow, because there's been no incentive in the intervening period for them to go and earn a meal themselves.
And I guess we all accept the wisdom of teaching a man to fish rather than handing him a flounder, but you really hear about the importance of fish markets. I mean, tell us how cash crops, microfinance, and commercial farming figure in your programs.
Well, in looking at, I suppose, the environment in sub-Saharan Africa, up to 80% of the population of most countries in sub-Saharan Africa work in agriculture. So if you're going to shift the needle, if you're going to try and get money in people's pockets, you've got to do it in farming, really. And so what we were looking at was this notion of how you increase agricultural productivity. And yes, some of that is used by people who are growing the food to feed themselves. But frankly, the harder bit is to try to monetize that. Can they get the surplus that they're not going to eat to a market, convert it into cash, and then all else follows?
Right.
If you build a livelihood, if you build an income, you don't have to tend to build a school or a clinic or whatever else. African communities themselves will look after that.
They'll
You
figure out
fix
how
the
to do
incomes.
it. They'll figure out how to do it themselves. You know, it's funny. I had the pleasure of attending the last two charity balls that Self-Help Africa held in Boston. The first time, maybe I had a little bit too much wine, and I ended up having a very lively conversation with the gala organizer about what sounded to me like very conventional messaging. And the next year, I was really pleasantly surprised to see that the banner headline at the gala changed to "Only Profits Can Cure Poverty," which I ended up stealing as the title of the Forbes column I wrote about the event. Do you find it difficult to preach the gospel of prosperity through profits?
You know, I think people are a little bit more open to it, and particularly in the United States. So we grew out of an organization which was founded in the UK and in Ireland. And on that side of the water, I think the pro-profit, pro-enterprise message is a little bit more suspect. Here, you know, we like to talk about, okay, we're a member of the non-profit sector, but frankly, we're only about profit. We're about putting profit into the pockets of the poor. So it's about being, I suppose, anti-welfare from that perspective.
Well, tell the audience a little bit about pig loans. I remember learning about this from you, and then how pig loans get repaid.
Okay. Well, the basic premise that we try to adopt across all our programs is that nothing is free except knowledge. So we will teach rural communities how to farm more efficiently, how to get access to markets, how to become, frankly, business people as opposed to just farmers. So that particular pig scheme is one whereby there isn't an awful lot of work with pigs in rural Africa. So you introduce pigs to a community by introducing 2 female and 1 male pigs to a particular farmer, what we call a lead farmer. He or she has been given specific training on how to handle the pigs.
And how do you select that lead farmer? I mean, there must be a lot of people applying.
You know, in some senses, they're kind of self-selecting. In any community, here in the States or in Africa, you will always get people who put their hands up, who are the first adopters. So as the person who got the first iPhone out there would be the equivalent in Africa, would be our lead farmer. And those who followed with the iPhone 5 would be follower farmers. You get those across any community. So you identify your farmer, you put the bulk of your training and development into that farmer, you give that farmer the pigs, and the first 6 pigs from that litter are handed on to the next 2 neighboring farmers who have also then undergone training with that lead farmer. So you can reach a lot of people fairly efficiently. And the basic premise is there's nothing for free. You know, you may get it 3 pigs technically for free, but the next 6 that you have that you would otherwise sell, you're giving them away.
So it's a pay it forward scheme.
Exactly. And we try to do the same in seed development and in various other forms of agricultural development. What you see in Africa are very strong communities. I mean, people talk about it, you know, across Africa, there's corruption, governments are broken. And yes, to a certain extent, yes. But what you do really find are very, very strong community systems. If you can tap into that, you will see very quickly that you will have a lead farmer who has groups of 20, 30, 40 farmers following him or her, following their lead, their training, their development, and their advice. And that's a really efficient way to get learning through African communities.
So you leverage the community rather than try to replace it at the top.
Absolutely. I mean, we're called self-help for a reason. This is not about top-down. This is not about a large contingent of expatriates going into a particular country in Africa. It is all African staffed in Africa, and it's about leveraging the community's strength.
Well, speaking of the African perspective, let me ask you, the controversy that seems to be swirling about genetically modified organisms or GMO crops has touched Africa in interesting ways. Perhaps you can give us your perspective on that.
Well, here's the thing. You know, farming in Africa is very different to farming in the United States. Very significant. The vast majority of the U.S. crop in corn and soy is GMO. GMO has very little traction on the ground in Africa. That's probably because European agriculture has a stronger influence in Africa right now than the United States
Why is that?
does. You know, I think it's probably traditionally Europe had more interest and colonized Africa to begin with. So the structures that were in place relied more heavily on the Europeans than they did on the States. You know, I think, here's the thing. Self-Help Africa believes that whatever suits the farmer, we're not going to stand in his or her way. If there is a farmer who genuinely believes that GMO is the way to go, absolutely. I mean, we would do whatever it is to support that. At the moment, our feeling is that, number one, it's probably not commercially viable for most very small farms and very small farmers. The risk involved in terms of buying the seed is just too great. So they're not the same as US farmers. And number two, GMO seed is only licensed for commercial use in about 3 countries out of 54 in sub-Saharan Africa.
So it's not even available.
There you go.
Well, that solves the problem. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of those crops were designed for drought resistance, pest resistance, for using less pesticides. And you would think one of the most obvious places to apply it would be in Africa, but it's curious to see that it hasn't gotten much traction.
Well, I think there's an inherent caution or maybe suspicion in relation to the position and the role of big agribusiness in some of this. Here's the other thing. There are many methods by which small and impoverished farmers can overcome or can guard against a drought and climate change. So the use of organic fertilizers is one. The use of increased irrigation is another one. There are varieties of seed which are developed in national institutions across Africa which are not GMO but which are drought tolerant. So you don't have to turn to GMO.
A lot of ways to skin the cat. A lot of ways to skin the cat. Well, you'll be following the market, as it goes. Let me ask you, in the time remaining, give us the big picture. You've been at this quite a while. If you could look ahead 10 years, how do you see your programs and other programs like it evolving, and what would you most like to be doing in Africa 10 years from now?
Well, look, here's a word that I hate, okay? The word that I hate is charity. And I think what we're doing is not charitable. I often say to somebody, hey, listen, you got a mortgage in your house. You got a loan from a bank, a commercial bank for that. Do you think they gave you charity? And the answer is inevitably, absolutely not. And a lot of the work that we're doing tends to be on that basis. We're investing in communities and they're paying it back. And they're paying it back either monetarily by repaying microfinance or microloans, or they're repaying it back by paying their neighbors, as it were, in some senses. I would love to see the end of charity and Africa, frankly. I'd love to see a situation where the work that we're doing is increasingly at the higher technical level and that the structures which gradually are being built up and put in place across Africa grow and develop. African farming, Africa represents 60% of the world's remaining unused arable land. Now, we have a big problem across the world. We've got to figure out a way of feeding an extra, over 1 billion people by 2050.
Well, what's the biggest missing ingredient? If it's not the knowledge that you give them, what's the biggest missing ingredient for Africa to pull itself up by its bootstraps, particularly in agribusiness?
You know what? Everybody is looking for that magic bullet, that silver bullet, and there is no silver bullet. There is a range of ingredients that are missing. Access to finance is a huge problem. And if there's one thing that I see that gives me a lot of hope, it's that a lot of venture capitalists and we'll say patient capitalists are now getting a patient investment is getting involved in Africa, looking at the range of different opportunities that there are across the continent. Knowledge is a huge problem. And look, it's getting hotter and drier across Africa, so it's tougher to produce. But it represents, as I say, a huge opportunity for the world at large. We've got to figure out a way of producing more food using fewer resources. And Africa is one of is perhaps the world's greatest untapped resource from that perspective.
And what about sort of cultural and governmental institutions? I mean, you work in many different countries. You must see a variety of institutions, some more corrupt, others less corrupt. You're a former lawyer yourself, I understand. Are the legal systems mature enough to support the kind of contracts required to build large agribusinesses? What does that look like?
Yeah, there isn't a particularly evolved culture on the legal side in terms of agricultural contract work across Africa. But at the same time, you can do business there. I think it's about understanding culture and putting the building blocks in place. Let's face it, when American business first started doing business with China, I'm sure there were some missteps in the beginning, and culturally both sides had to evolve. And I think this is the same with Africa. If you want to go and you want to do business in rural Africa, anywhere across the continent of Africa, it requires a bit of a shift on the part of the Africans selling, and it requires a bit of a shift on the part of for example, the American private sector player buying into it.
Well, in the time remaining, tell us a little bit more about Self-Help Africa itself. Clearly, you're supported by donors. Maybe you can let listeners know where they can get more information. I'd like to know whether you're going to do another event in Boston in 2014. Where can people find out more?
Well, the best place to start is at our website, selfhelpafrica.org. Would certainly love to see you, Bill, at an event in 2014. We plan one in May in Boston. And yes, I mean, currently we hold public fundraising events in New York and in Boston and shortly in San Francisco. But the best place, as I say, to start and hubs from is that website. We're supported quite heavily by the US governments, British, European governments, but about 20 to 25% of our funding comes from the public. So it's very important for us. In effect, what we say is if you give us $1, we'll find $3 of government money out there to make it $4 by the time it hits Africa.
And how many folks work at Self Help Africa on how many continents?
Well, we're like to focus our efforts in Africa, obviously, and the bulk of our staff are there across 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa now, shortly to be 10. And so there were about 200 local staff across Africa. We work an awful lot with partner organizations too, building local capacity. We have some personnel, some technical staff in Europe, and primarily a fundraising side here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, Will, I really appreciate your time today. Our guest today has been Will Galvin from Self Help Africa. I do hope we can follow your progress in the years ahead. Thanks for being part of the program.
Thank you, Bill.
You've been listening to Real Clear Radio Hour. This is your host, Bill Frezza. Thanks for being with us.